Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Michele Tracy Berger. I'm an academic and speculative fiction writer. Everything I write tends to have an element of psychological horror to it. My collection, Doll Seed, debuted in 2024 with Aunt Books, and it spans horror, contemporary fantasy, paranormal, and a little sci-fi. I'm also a coach, and so if you are new here, this channel is named after my coaching practice, The Creative Tickle, where we take a fun and accessible approach to creativity and specialize in helping writers. And one of the things that I love to do is connect with writers and hear about their process. I'm so excited to be here with Ed Southern, and I'm going to do a little bit of a bio for him. Ed is the author of Fight Songs, a story of love and sports in a complicated South, The Jamestown Adventure, Voices of the American Revolution in the Carolinas, and the short story collection Parlous Angels. And most recently, The Devil's Done Come Back, New Ghost Tales from North Carolina. One of the reasons I invited him today is to hear about his experience editing this collection, and I'm happy to say I have a story in it as well. His work has also appeared in South Writ Large, the Asheville Poetry Review, Story South, the NC 10 by 10 Play Festival, and elsewhere. And since 2008, he has been the executive director of the North Carolina Writers Network, and an amazing one at that. We'll talk about that. He lives in Winston-Salem. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks very much, Michelle. It's good to be here.
So I said a little bit about what you write, but tell us a little bit more about, who you are, what you do, what other stuff you write.
There's to tell. Let's see. Yeah, most recently I edited the anthology The Devil's Don't Come Back, New Ghost Tales from North Carolina, which you were kind enough to contribute to. Um, I write across genres with no plan or strategy. I just sort of go where the spirit moves me. Fiction and nonfiction. Um, and used to be I wrote some poetry, but not so much anymore. I'm not sure what that says about me. But I had an essay out in the most recent issue of Cold Mountain Review, and then some short fiction that's going to be coming out in the next year or so.
And thank you so much for that. And I feel like, yeah, we've never, even though I know, I'll just say for everyone listening and watching, I know Ed pretty well through him being the executive director of the amazing North Carolina Writers Network. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about, I think you're super passionate about literary community and building community. But digging more into your writing, I mean, I know you've always written, but that you do cross genres. And I think that's really hard to do. And I'm someone who tries to do that as well. So always looking for new models. And I actually don't know. So as we talk about this amazing collection, I don't really know how the origins of it came to be. And I'd love for you to say a little bit about the collection and what was the prompt for it. And
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was working on a different project and I got stuck. I wasn't sure where I wanted it to go. And I I remembered how much I had loved these collections of North Carolina ghost stories when I was a kid. There was a kind of a glut of them that came out in the late 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, um, as North Carolina was changing dramatically from a very rural agricultural state into a modern industrial technological place. Um, and so I went back and started rereading some of these collections that I hadn't picked up in decades, thinking maybe I would find, some inspiration there or be reminded of something that would help me get unstuck. Um, and reading them, and I realized this is an odd thing to say about ghost stories, but I realized how woefully out of date they were with some of the uh, assumptions that they made, some of the blind spots that the authors had. And so I thought, you know, these stories need to be told again. The whole point of these collections was to gather together and to preserve and print stories that have been told in North Carolina for generations. And, but that doesn't mean that they should stop there. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice um, to tell these stories new for a new generation for generations to come? Uh, the really, what I didn't know was whether other writers would share my interest in it. And one of the very gratifying things about putting this collection together was um, how many people did want to contribute and were as eager to do so as I had hoped.
Well, it's been fantastic kind of reading through the collection and just thinking about, how the stories really complement each other. And someone, even though I lived in North Carolina for 20 years, I'm not a North Carolinian. So and I'd be curious to hear some of the people that you worked with might have known. So some people created new stories, sort of new tales that maybe had just a little bit of a root somewhere else, and other people actually retold tales, right? That in terms of kind of thinking about the breadth of the collection. And I guess I have a couple of questions for you as an editor. What this is not your first edited volume. Is this your
So, no, it's not the first anthology that I've edited. No,
okay, first fiction anthology or
it is the first fiction anthology,
okay. So
as
just
far
for
as I know.
just as far for some of our emerging writers or people who are kind of new listening in, watching us, there's a couple of different ways that anthologies work. You can see a call for a themed anthology and submit toward that. You can also be invited, and sometimes the editor knows you well, doesn't know you well. So, could you talk a little bit about your process when you were thinking about that, putting the collection together, and also what did you learn about yourself as an editor this time around doing fiction, which is different, obviously, than nonfiction.
Yeah. I Well, in my case, it was a little bit of a cheat because I have worked for a long time with the North Carolina Writers Network and have gotten to know a lot of writers around the state. And so I had a pretty good hunch as to writers which writers um might be interested in this and would be able to do it well. you know um and so I wasn't so much I wasn't casting about in the dark hoping to get good responses. Like, I was able to be pretty targeted in who I invited. And let me say too, there were a lot of North Carolina writers that I would have loved to invite in addition to those that I did, but my publisher kept reminding me, okay, this book can only be so long. We don't want a book that thick, which it very easily could have been. Um, and so I did have sort of what might be an unfair advantage. And I didn't have to put out a general call for submissions and go through whatever came in that way. I was able to ask specific writers, and of all the writers that I invited, only two turned me down, and that was because they were on deadline for other projects already, and simply didn't have the time. You also asked what I learned about myself editing fiction. That's always, or I don't know, I always find that a fraught question to try to answer. I well, and I'm going to say too that again, I had a possibly unfair advantage in that before I came to the Writers Network, I worked in publishing for a press that had a really outstanding senior editor. And so I learned a lot from him about, you know, uh, how light your editing hand needs to be, when you're working with other writers and their work. Um, that you may, there's a fine line between um, making critical suggestions, making editorial suggestions, and trying to take over someone else's work and substitute your own voice for theirs, which is to me a cardinal sin of editing. And so again, I just kept thinking of his name is Stephen Kirk, and I just
Mm.
kept thinking,
Oh
what's
yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
is
he
it-
wrote, he
what
also
what
wrote a book, a writing book a long time
he did
ago.
Scribbler
Uh,
stalking the authors of Western North Carolina, which is I think one of the great um, uh, what's the word that I'm looking for? Underappreciated
yes.
books about writing. I think and I'm biased because he's a friend, but I think it's one of the best books about writing and about writers. In fact, I can see it on my shelf from where I'm sitting,
And funny
and
too.
really sorry,
I'm sorry. And he's funny too.
and very funny. Yeah, Steve has a terrific dry sense of humor. I know from sitting in meetings with him, he can sit there silently for an hour and then just say one line that just it breaks up the meeting because everyone's laughing so hard. So
Well, I so appreciate that. One, I love the fact that I didn't know that he was your, someone who mentored you and you worked with him. So that's great. And I also think as an editor, I can say the experience being edited by you, I really appreciated the clarity and like questions that you would raise of, is this what you mean? And so you did have a very thoughtful and light touch. And I
thank you.
think, yeah, I really appreciated that. The other thing that I think is important to say to remind people, so you've been working in the field for a long time and you've made relationships with writers. And I think for people who are emerging writers, it's really important to build literary community. And you do that in a lot of different ways. You go and see other writers read, you're in writing groups, you go to conferences ideally, or online or in person. But that sense of a network is really powerful because then people will think of you, even if if you're an emerging writer or not as well, newly published or early in your publishing career, people will think of you for these kinds of things. So I think that's another piece. Do you want to say, I have some questions about submission about the book, but do you want to say something about literary community and
Well, I mean, I think to your point, and there's the idea of literary community, which to me is has more to do with supporting one another, with providing a boost for what is a very lonely and oftentimes very frustrating pursuit. In fact, right before I logged in to this, I happened to glance at my inbox and saw my latest rejection,
Mhm.
from a literary magazine. Like it happens to all of us, and it continues to happen to all of us, and that's just part of the reality of it. And so I think community is important to help us get through those moments of discouragement, the moments of frustration, but also there's the idea of literary networking, of making connections. One of the most common gripes that you'll hear from writers when they do get frustrated, when they do face disappointments is, well, it's not how well you write, it's who you know. And I think in some regards that's an excuse. I think when you're submitting to literary journals, for the most part, it's the story, and it's not necessarily that your story's rejected because it's bad. It's just not what they're looking for at this point. But there are a lot of things, you know, opportunities in the literary world that come about not necessarily because of like who you know, but who knows what about you. you
Yes.
know, one
Yes.
of the advantages that I had I talked about I was able to have a strong idea of what North Carolina writers would be interested in this would be able to um, you know, give me something good for this collection, but I also had a good idea of who would be good to work with, who would respect the deadlines that we set. Um, who would, if I did have to edit a piece, who would be receptive to editing and who wouldn't. Um, and that sort of thing. I mean, if people know that you know know you've made connections, but they also know that you're a good person to work with. They want to work with you. So I just I guess that's a long way of saying, like, just be a good person, and it goes a long, in addition to being a good writer, it goes a long way.
I love it. And I think it's both the literary community and the literary networking. They, go hand in hand. I really appreciate how you said that, because it's what people think about you and know about you. Um, so I always ask when I'm talking with folks, writers, to tell us a submission story. And I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about how Blair moved forward or another piece of writing that has a submission story that you want to share.
Think, the submission story for this collection for what became The Devils Don't Come Back was pretty straightforward. So I don't know that it makes a good story. I went to Blair, who, um, in former iterations, Blair published a lot of these classic collections of ghost stories I was talking about. So when I
Mm.
said a
Mm.
collection of new North Carolina ghost stories, they said yes immediately. There wasn't much of a story there. Um, my previous book with them, Fight Songs, um, was a little more interesting. I've here again, I've known their senior editor, Robin Miura, for a very long time, and
Shout out to Robin. She's amazing.
she is amazing. And as you know, she also edits South writ Large, a wonderful online journal, and I had a pretty long essay that I'd been working on about you know college sports fandom and how that ties into questions of identity and questions of place. Um, and I sent it to her and said, would you be interested in this for South writ Large? And very quickly she wrote back and said, "Good Lord, no, that's far too long. Um, but would you be interested in expanding it into a book?" And I said, "No, there's not enough there." I was like, I don't, I think I've said most of what I have to say. I don't think I can really, I don't know where else I would go with this to make it book length. And I happened to be coming through Durham not long after where their office was at the time. And she and I met for lunch. And, and over the course of the lunch, we, got to talking about the ideas that were in the essay. And she started asking questions like, well, what about this? What about that? It got me thinking about it and essentially talked me into, convinced me that, yeah, there was enough there, that it wouldn't just be filler or padding. There was enough there still to explore that would be worth turning it into something book length.
That's an amazing story. And I feel like I knew that somewhere along the line, but had forgotten it. And so I had shared with Ed that I'm working on a longer project about the submission process and dealing with, all the different levels that one has to navigate, motivation, rejection, all of that. But that I really believe there's so many different ways that we can be published. And some
Yeah,
of it is about building relationships over time. But the most important thing, also the piece of your story, it's like you submitted, you finished something and submitted it.
yeah,
And, she was interested and had a different vision for it. And that's such an important thing. Like we never know where some an editor is going to take something and run with it, and it's bigger than what you imagine, which I love. Now, how many chapters did it turn out to be, if you remember, if you can?
I don't remember the number of chapters. I remember, I want to say it's around 75 to 80,000 words was what it ended up being. And I don't remember how many chapters that broke down into, but because it really, and like I say, she, I say convinced me. It wasn't so much that she was selling me on the idea as pointing out to me, you know, aspects that I hadn't gotten into and that were worth exploring that I'd be interested in exploring.
Right, and it was like a mutual recognition of like, oh, I could expand this. I didn't think I was going to do, but I could to much success. I remember you did a book tour and got to talk about your book and got to do all of that. How long did it take you, if I can ask, to write the full manuscript, if you remember?
It's about 2 years. Um, and of course, and this ended up becoming part of the book was COVID hit in the midst of my writing, which I might could have gotten it done in about a year and a half if not for COVID, but that sort of you know uh, slowed everything down and ended up I realized and you may have heard me tell this story before because it sounds like a scene from a cheesy movie, but I was it was Fourth of July weekend and I'd gone off by myself somewhere to work on this and um, I was typing and my fingers began to slow on the keyboard and came to a stop. And I picked up my phone and called Robin and said, I'm not going to be able to write this book the way I had planned. The world has changed too much, hasn't it?
Mm,
And she sighed and said, yeah, you're right. And so we, with her help, I sort of like refocused the book from that point and
mm,
incorporated all the changes that were coming to pass in 2020 into the narrative, into the story that I was trying to tell.
mm. Love it. And we writers have to pivot for all sorts of different reasons and all sorts of different ways, and that was a big one. Thank you. That was such a good submission story. So, what's a tip for our aspiring writers out there, maybe who are newer to the publishing game and the submission game? What's a tip that you feel
Mhm.
like you could share?
It's funny. I just had lunch yesterday with a friend of mine who is has begun the process of querying a manuscript that she's finished, and so it was a nice warm up for this interview today to answer her questions and and I always say like you know whenever you ask an author like how do I get published? I mean, any writer who's being honest is going to say to you, I don't know. I'm still figuring that out myself, even if they have been published many times. Um, it, it, there's an old saying among writers that, each, you know, the book itself teaches you how to write it. No two books are written the same way. And I think that to a certain extent that goes for publishing as well. Um, we're all trying to figure it out as best as we can. I would say, um, it, the one piece of advice that I've given writers since my days in publishing um, is worry only about writing something that you're proud of,
Mm,
because that's just about the only part of this process that you can control. Everything else. In fact, the friend that I was talking to yesterday told me about had queried one agent who said that she liked what my friend had sent, but is going through, has a family member going through some health challenges right now and can't take on any additional clients.
Mm,
you know.
mm,
And so assuming that that wasn't just an excuse, you know, talk about something that's completely out of your control. You've written a good manuscript that the agent likes, but they're just not in a place where they can take it on right now. Um,
mm,
so much of publishing, of book selling, comes down to luck. And just, timing, all of these factors that you have no control over. Um, the news just came out that the Washington Post is cutting its book section. And I don't know when the last, when that section will cease to be published. But I'm sure there are authors out there who had books lined up to be reviewed in the Washington Post or to
mm,
get coverage in the Washington Post, which would be a tremendous boost to sales. And now that's not going to happen. And again, something that you had no control over as a writer, as an author. Um, so, you know, it's hard to accept. And I say this even as someone who has told people this for a long time now, but really just try to focus on writing something that you're proud of. That has to be your only goal. Um, because otherwise you're counting on other people to achieve your goals for you, and that's just no way to live.
mm. So powerful. And write, I feel like write a lot of, if I can just add a little footnote, write a lot of things that you're proud of. So if you get your one thing and you turning it out, it's a manuscript or a book manuscript or a short story and it gets rejected, okay, put it away, work on the next thing, keep going, and then you will have actually a number of things circulating. And as your craft levels up, that also helps. But you're absolutely right. In the end, like we have to be proud of the work. Um, and I think
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really great advice. Speaking of book sell, oh, did you want to?
No, 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 no. Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, speaking of book selling and all that good stuff, where can people find you and where can people find the book?
People can find me. I have a website, edsouthern.com, that I hardly ever update, but it does have my contact information in there. Multiple ways to get in touch with me if you would like to. So that's probably the best place to find me. Um, you may find me on Facebook and Instagram,
Yeah,
but you might not.
I
So
feel like
I highly discourage anyone, anyone who wants to get in touch with me, I highly discourage you from trying to reach me through social media. Um, the best way is to go to edsouthern.com and find my contact information. I have a contact page that you can use. Of course, you can also reach me through my day job with the North Carolina Writers Network. Our website is ncwriters.org. And that's another good way if you're interested in literary community. Um, and you don't have to be in North Carolina to be a part of the North Carolina Writers Network. So if that intrigues you, by all means, you can reach out to me there. The book, The Devil's Done Come Back.
I'll
Uh,
put it. I'll just while
yes,
you're
thank you.
talking.
Well, I have,
Oh,
all
you
right, so
got your.
one of the ironies of being a published author is that you have this beautiful book. I mean, Blair did such a great job with the cover, with the design of this book, and then you take your copy out on tour and just beat it all to hell. Um, and so, but I kind of feel like this is like an honest representation for writers of what your published book will look like if you're lucky. You get it out there, you get to go on a tour, you get to read it in front of people. It's going to end up looking like this. Um, but yeah, it should be available in any bookstore in North Carolina. Of course, you can also get it online at bookshop.org, or through the publisher Blair. Their website is blairpub.com. Blairpub.com? Oh, gracious. I should know that. But if you look up Blair Publisher, you'll be able to find it.
Well, and I will say that you are active now. You're more active than you used to be on Instagram. So you can, I know, and you write really terse, funny. I'll just brag on you for a minute because like watching your evolution over many years especially with social media. And I mean, your Facebook, you mostly post very specific things related to North Carolina writers, blah blah blah. But your Instagram page gets a you do different things there, and I'm always intrigued. So I feel like that's a good format. So behind the scenes, people should know we're always encouraging it. You're not on TikTok yet. I'm not on TikTok either, but
No.
you always give out really thoughtful content, and
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
um, this was so wonderful, and I thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I hope people really think about, the tips that you gave, and also that wonderful submission story because it just shows lots of different ways to get published. And looking forward to reading more of your writing, and we'll have you on again at some point.
So thanks very much, Michelle. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks.